in the Old Testament, there are prophets, there are kings, and there's priests.
Yeah.
There's not anyone who's all three. I remember many years ago at Leadership Network, Bob Buford was a massive fan of Peter Drucker. He would quote Peter Drucker as saying this: "I've known thousands of people who were really good at one thing. I've known a few people, listen, thousands to a few, who were good at two. I've never known anybody who was good at three."
Wow.
And so the three roles in the Old Testament church, you had the prophet who brings God's word to God's people. You had the priest who brings God's care to God's people. And then you had the king who brings God's order to God's people. And I think those roles actually exist in the church today.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Next Sunday podcast. I'm here with Jim Shepard.
We made it, Frank. It's 2025.
I just gave him the look and he's like, wait a second, my turn? Your turn?
It's
Wait,
my turn. It's 2025, Frank.
We made it. We've arrived.
We've made it.
Yeah, that's so good.
Now, we haven't made it a year yet. I mean, because that would be
Not as a podcast.
No, we haven't made it a year. We're 9 months or so.
That's
but
right.
we made it to a new year. We clicked
That's
off a
it.
number.
That's it.
2025.
Now we get to say we have episodes in 2024 and 2025.
Unbelievable.
Feels significant. I don't know. The episode for today, I'm really excited about it because this is content that you casually referenced in a previous episode, and immediately I was like, wait, what? How did you know that? And then I double clicked for the moment and you gave me the 5 and I said, all right, table this. We got to stay focused. This was extremely compelling content, Jim. This idea and the clarity around this. I think it's clearer than most job descriptions. I think it's very clarifying for senior leaders. I think other leaders in the church need to hear this and understand how important it is that a senior leader focus on these 5 things. And that's what you told me. You said there are 5 roles for a senior pastor, period. And you were super clear and passionate about it. And so I would love today for you to share those 5 roles. You can decide if you want to do one at a time, give them all 5 up top, and then we kind of unpack them. However you want to do it, doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, I think this can be a consequential episode because I think it can give pastors a lot of clarity and their teams a lot of clarity of what the biggest win to lean into their senior leaders.
Well, the whole thing started, you know that I coach a lot of church planters, have a real passion for that. Yep. There's something about incubating something and starting it and watching it take shape. And it started with, caveats and warnings for these pastors on what to do and what not to do.
Okay.
Because as a church planter, you don't have that much in terms of staff resourcing, and you can easily get pulled in a lot of directions. Yeah. But then I started to recognize, well, gosh, this isn't just church planters. This is churches at all levels.
Yeah.
I watch pastors and I sit behind closed doors and listen to pastors. A lot of what I do, close the door, we're not taking any notes, just having a conversation, all off the record, in the vault, right? And so when people started talking, for example, about burnout stuff, I'm like, well, gosh, I've been hearing about that for years, right? And I think it comes out of it. I don't want to go deep into that one. I'm not necessarily an expert on that. People are better at that than I am. But I think it starts with what I call an impossible job description.
Yeah.
Made worse by the pastor stretching it even beyond that, right? So the impossible job description is what people expect of you. Yeah. And then what you add to that is what you put pressure on yourself to meet those expectations and then even more. Yeah. And it becomes, it's like, I think most of us had a hamster or a guinea pig or something when we were little and they got in that little thing and they were running and they never went anywhere. Yeah. And that's what it feels like to me. You're spending a lot of energy, but you're not getting anywhere. And then you're wondering, well, what is it's almost like the movie. Is that all? Is this as good as it gets? Jack Nicholson. Is this as good as it gets? Right. And so it really is rooted in a biblical model that I just extracted. So the biblical model is where I started with the caveat. Okay. And then once I started with the caveat, I developed these 5 things. I'm trying to give you some background. We'll go into this here in a minute. So the biblical piece is this, is in the Old Testament, there are prophets, there are kings, and there's priests. Yeah. There's not anyone who's all 3.
Yep.
There's not actually anyone who's 2. There's 1. right? I remember many years ago at Leadership Network, Bob Buford was a massive fan of Peter Drucker. He would quote Peter Drucker as saying this: "I've known thousands of people who were really good at one thing. I've known a few people, listen, thousands to a few, who were good at two." Peter Drucker, the father of the modern, marketplace management movement. I've never known anybody who was good at three.
Wow.
Drucker.
Yeah.
Drucker said that. I mean, that struck me when I heard that the first time, 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, when Bob Buford said that for the first time. And so that kind of informed that. And so the three roles in the Old Testament church, you had the prophet who brings God's word to God's people. You had the priest who brings God's care to God's people. And then you had the king who brings God's order to God's people. And I think those roles actually exist in the church today.
Yeah.
For the most part, right? And so the prophet is really the pastor. The king is the executive pastor, for lack of a better, or somebody on staff who functions like that, right? Who's in charge of all the administration and making order out of all this stuff that, prophets and all the prophecy create a mess. They're visionaries. They see things that other people don't see. That's why they are who they are. But somebody has to come behind that, put some glue and some wireframe on it and make it actually work. And then the priest is that, is that person who is, say, the care pastor or the congregational care pastor, whoever that is. And what happens is senior pastors begin to move over into those other lanes, I would say generally to their peril.
Okay.
Generally to their peril, and especially church planters. So, for example, if you're the prophet and you start to try to do the priestly role, then you've got a lot of people who are coming to you, and at some point you're going to have the Jethro conversation with Moses.
That's right.
Moses, these people are coming to you. You're unhappy because so many of them are coming to you. They're unhappy because you're not meeting their needs.
Right.
We got to try a different model here.
Yeah, that's good.
Right? And what I tell these pastors is, don't let your need for people get in the way of your effectiveness and what you're called to do, which is to be the prophet. Right? I know you'd love to solve their needs, but you can't scale to that. Your church won't even grow very big before it's bigger than what you can take care of. And then once you're not accessible, when you were accessible and now you're not, they're like, well, look at Frank. He's just gotten too big for his britches here. Right? So you're just causing all kind of problems for yourself. And we could go down this road, but I think everybody understands where we're going with this. So it was out of that. And by the way, I know there are going to be some senior pastors who are going to say, Jim, I get it. I see that. I do not pretend that this is, on the stone tablets. This is from my perspective.
Sure.
And other godly people might have a different take on this, and it's okay. But for the church planters in particular that I've been able to keep inside of these 5 things, they're healthier than the people who are not.
That's great.
Because they're not being stretched in too many different directions, right? You and I were at a church, at a conference, kind of a off-the-radar conference not here too long ago, and the question on the table was, why do we keep creating churches that chew up and spit out pastors?
Yeah.
Remember that question?
Yeah, it's a great question.
It's a heck of a question, right? Well, some of it is on this impossible job description that we've created for ourselves, right? So, in the senior pastor, this is the 5 things that I think a senior pastor, you could do some of the other things. I think this is really primary. Number 1, you are God's prophet. You preach God's word to God's people. Now, you would say, Jim, what about a teaching team? Well, that's fine, but you got to lead the teaching team. Right? You got to be the one who's in charge of vetting the people who get to stand before God's people. I mean, you're responsible for that. So you're God's prophet. You're bringing God's word to God's people, even if it involves other people on a team. That's you. That falls to you. You can't delegate that. Second thing is, you're going to cast God's vision based on God's leading. Now, one of the things I would say to all of our senior pastors who be careful about calling it your vision. I don't think you really mean that, but because it's not. It's the vision that God gave you. And so let's make sure that we say the words that if you're saying your vision, I think most of you probably mean it's the vision that God gave you. Well, let's say it that way. This is the vision that God gave me for the future of our church. Because that's one of your roles.
That's good.
You can't delegate that. Now, by the way, some of that gets spoken into because you've got to vet that with your board and say, hey, here's what I think God's seeing, and God's going to validate that. If you've got 5 or 7, people on your board who say, Pastor, I'm not seeing any of that. You probably need to pay attention to that.
Uh-oh.
But if you're getting, you and I both know that's a slippery slope. It could go a lot of directions. But it probably means that you're not seeing what everybody else is seeing.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you're wrong, but it does mean you need to take notice.
Yep.
So cast God's vision based on God's leading. Then this is your priestly role. There is a priestly role, but it's very limited. You pastor the close-in staff who pastor the rest of the church. So maybe it's 12, 14 people who are close in. Maybe it's 7. It might be 5. I don't know what it is. But your priestly responsibilities don't go beyond that. Your main priestly responsibility is for yourself and your family.
Yeah.
Because no church is going to be healthy without the pastor being healthy. You go down a side road here for a second. People are always asking me the question, before the election and the economy and this and that and the other. Well, what do you about this? What about this? Well, if your pastor's unhealthy, that's going to cause a lot more financial harm in your church than anything else that you just talked about, right? Yeah. But we don't prioritize that.
That's right.
So, make it where the pastor's span of care is very limited, but includes first and foremost, himself and his family.
Yeah.
So pastor the staff who will then pastor the church. Number 4, you're in charge of assembling leadership capital, mainly the ones who are going to be your direct reports. You're not responsible for a ministry assistant to a department head. That's not your job. But you are responsible for the people who are going to be on your executive team, for lack of a better word, or your lead team, or your whatever you call them. If it's 5, if it's 3, whatever that is, that's your role. Those people, none of those people get onto the staff without having been vetted by you.
Yeah.
And some of that needs to include not just, the competence evaluation. I would say it involves a spiritual examination as well, right? To make sure that you're the kind of person that will fit in well here. So assemble and develop key leadership team. And then number 5, you're responsible for making sure that the financial resources are in place for the vision that God's called the church to. And that means you're going to have to teach about money. You're going to teach about money as discipleship. You're going to teach about money as resourcing for God's ministry. You're going to talk, that's your role. And once you understand, if you take most of what you do and put it inside those 5, I predict a couple of things will happen, Frank. First of all, I think your effectiveness will be better because you're really focused.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is you're likely to be healthier emotionally, spiritually, and physically because you're now living inside of the confines of a job description that's actually reasonable.
Yeah.
So,
fantastic.
where do you want to go? That's the 5. You've probably got lots of questions.
Great. I got all kinds of questions.
I know you do.
Let me start with this one. Let me start with a hard question. So what do you do if you're a pastor and you accidentally delegated one of these or intentionally delegated one of these and now you got to reel it back in and take ownership? How do you navigate that conversation?
Yeah, that could be tricky, Frank. That is a good question. I love that question because, leadership is about taking responsibility for things you've done, whether those be the right things or the wrong things. Mm-hmm. And I would just, for me, me, and if there's an elephant in the room, I'm just going to name the elephant and take it head on. Hey, Frank. So I know that we had you and I had agreed some time ago that you were going to be a part of, whatever that was that I was giving to you. Let's just say that probably hadn't given you casting vision, but maybe I'm letting you pastor the staff. Mm-hmm. I feel like I need to step back into some of that.
Yeah.
And not that you're not doing a good job. That has nothing to do with it. I just feel like it's part of my role as the pastor. Now, I think in this case, you would share it. So sharing is not the same as delegating, right? Because in terms of if you've got a teaching team, you're sharing the prophet role. You're not delegating the prophet role, right? Because you're not going to let anybody preach who hasn't met your criteria for standing on that stage and preaching to your people. And there's not going to be any content that gets preached that you haven't vetted, right? So you can share it, but not delegate it. So I would just sit down and just have the conversation. It's not about you. It's about me.
Yeah. It's tough, but it needs to happen.
Yeah, and what gets in the way is sensitive feelings and egos, and that's where you have to navigate the things. And, so if the person were a stronger personality, then you'd probably navigate that a little bit differently than if they were a little bit more tender in their personality.
What one do you see that people let go of the fastest? Where do you see that they tend to hold the other ones, but this is the one that kind of slips through?
Number 5.
making sure financial resources are in place.
Yeah, no, and what I'd say is it's not doing it properly. So it's dealing with it transactionally all the time, asking for money, funding the budget, fund this, fund that.
Yep.
Hardcore year-end press without any discipleship in it. We got to make the budget. We got to make the budget. Yeah. I'm all for making the budget, but it's a discipleship moment. It's not a transactional moment. And I think the thing is that if we'll actually approach it from that transformational standpoint, I think we take the lid off of the things that are actually transactional. So number 5 is probably the one that I see that they let go of the quickest, probably followed by number 3, not pastoring the staff well.
Is there one that's super helpful? Is there one of these or is there a 6th one that, this is putting you on the spot, a 6th one that pastors think is involved in this list that's not on this list? Is there something that they tend to hold tight or spend a lot of time on that's not on this list, but is one of those things that kind of leads to burnout and stress because they're trying to carry one of these things in the wrong way? Or carry something in addition to this, I'm sorry.
Well, it's not a pure number 6, Frank, but it would be this one. Letting yourself be drawn into conversations and meetings that would take you out of these 5.
Okay.
Right? So in other words, you're needlessly spending your time over here, maybe just because there are a lot of important people in the room or because the content in the room. And I'm not saying you don't do that every now and then, but I see leaders in the church, senior leaders in the church, and I see them putting themselves in meetings, and I was just like, it's not even a good stewardship of your time.
Yeah.
Right? And it's adding to this stress and burnout and this impossible job description that's already sitting there in front of you. And what I'm trying to do to help senior leaders do is just kind of push back on that and make it something that you can live within.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one that I hear most often is not one, but it's this one. Well, Jim, you just don't understand what it's like to be a senior pastor day to day. Okay, I'll give you that.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the 5.
Right.
What have you got that's bigger than that? And every now and then I do get someone who has one circumstantially in their church that I was like, hey, bro, you got that. You got that. Pick one of the others probably after number 2. 1 and 2 have got to be on the list. 3, 4, and 5. If you wanted to put something else in 3, and I hear something every now and then would slip in as 5.
Yeah.
And I was just like, yeah, you get that one. But it's the you don't understand. That's true. I haven't been one. Yeah. But I've spent 32 years behind closed doors with a bunch of senior leaders who I think, Frank, are telling me stuff that they're not telling a whole lot of other people because it's in the vault. I'm not a threat to them. I'm not trying to take anything. I'm not trying to be in charge of anything. I'm not trying to get a job at their church. I'm not trying to do anything other than make them look good. And as a result of that, when they trust me, they'll say these things. And I've heard these things over the years.
Yeah. No, that's such great insight. How does a senior pastor communicate that these are the 5 things if the list from the congregation standpoint and or elders is currently 15 things? How do you lead through to get to say, no, these are the 5 I want to focus on, and this is healthy and good?
Well, the first thing is you're going to have your board bought into that, whoever your board is, whether it's your elders or a board of trustees or whatever your governance is. If you're an Episcopal church, it's your vestry. If you're in a Presbyterian church, it's going to be your session. Whatever that governance is, you're going to have them bought in and have your back on that.
That's great.
The next person needs to be your assistant. Whoever your executive assistant is. Your executive assistant needs to see this is the codified list of things that are most important. And you, as the gatekeeper to me, are in charge of helping me be accountable to that.
Yeah.
I would say almost on equal footing. Certainly not because the wife is at a different place, but because she's not there every day and see everything. But the wife has to be a part of that as well, the spouse, right? Holding them accountable for that. If they're staying over, if they're spending extra time at church, doing things that are not in the 5, hold them accountable for that, right?
Yeah.
And, I think the other thing is, one of the things we've done at my church over the years, we don't do it exactly the same now. Our founding pastor, when we used to have what we called the Inquirer's class, he would go through a list of things that, hey, if you come here, you can expect this, and if you come here, don't expect this. And one of the things he said right off the bat, I'll never forget this, Frank. He said, if you come here and you become a member of this church, I promise you 2 things. You will be well cared for, and it won't be by me.
Yeah.
I loved that. I loved that. he was deprecating to himself. He said, well, first of all, I'm not very good at it. He actually is better than he gives himself credit. But he said, more importantly, I can't my span of care doesn't go that far. I can't possibly make everybody happy. But we do have some people, and you'll be assigned to an elder, and you'll have, right, and they've made good on that promise. Yeah. Nancy and I have been well cared for over 23 years. But he said, you will be well cared for. It won't be me, because that ain't on his list. Yeah. Right? So and good. I loved that. That was even before I had the list of the 5 roles. But
so these 5 things, I think sometimes people include these things in a bigger word or bigger idea that then gives them permission to kind of go do whatever they want. So let me give you an example. Sometimes church or pastor will say, well, it's my job to protect the culture. And so they'll say assembling leadership capital is part of that, but that also means swinging wildly into random meetings to kind of gut check things and check everything and kind of run around and be in tons of things because they're guarding something or fighting against something. And so what I see is that oftentimes these clear directives get distorted with a bigger idea that then takes the clarity out of it. And now it's just kind of running around and doing a bunch of stuff. And so have you seen any of that where they're trying to redefine something like this? It's very clear. This is what you're responsible for. This is what you're not responsible for. And attaching it to an idea or theoretical concept that now gives them permission to kind of just go back to what the list might as well be 10 long.
Or 20.
20 or 25.
Which now we've got the impossible job description again, right? Which is going to cause you problems, going to cause burnout, cause stress, family problems at home because you're not spending time with your kid, all the other things that are manifesting themselves. Look, I get all of that. I get all of that. So let's take the culture thing, for example. That's actually embedded in here. Yeah. That's actually, and I would agree. You know what? That probably would be the 6th one. If I hear a 6th one, well, what about the culture? Somebody's got, well, like, well, Pastor, you do those 5, I think you'll have your culture set in place. Right. Because culture is not something that you talk about. Culture is something that you're doing all the things that cause it to happen. Correct. Not shooting right at the culture target. Right. We do. I mean, here, we don't talk about that. And I certainly don't find myself in all those places, but I think everybody here is pretty clear on it, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's just not a part. And I think the same thing happens at the church level. If I had somebody who I would make the chief culture officer, it would probably be that number 2, whoever it is. Yeah. I would say to him, Frank, you're the person who all the staff reports to, especially all the executive staff. It's your job to make sure that all of these cultural things that we think are important are being embedded in everything that we do here, right? And I think that's where you'd find that, not the passive. But it's a sexy thing, and so you find, and it's a fun thing, but you got to resist the temptation. That's right. And if you create your list of 5, you take one off, one of mine off, and put one of yours on. Then live by those 5. Right. You'll be healthier. You'll be more balanced. You won't be trying to fill the impossible job description. And hopefully you won't be a part of churches that are chewing up and spitting out pastors because they can't meet the job description. That's why that was such a great question. So good. Because it embeds so much of it. The congregation and the people have a part of it. The church and its leadership has a part of it. Both of them have a part in that. And that's how we solve that. And so we don't just keep chewing up and spitting out pastors. And I think the impossible job description is part of the problem. I love it. So speaking of impossible job description, when I was at my time at Elevation, we had this fun saying that we would say from time to time. And it was I really enjoyed it. We would say that we need a new hire. Okay, this is early on in the Elevation days. And we need a creative that's super artistic. And so we write a creative job description for them for video work or whatever it is. Okay, super simple. But then before we start interviewing, verbally, the job description's already changing because we'll say, we need somebody that's really creative, but hey, listen, they need to be organized. They need to be very organized. They need to be able to work in our system and structure and meet deadlines and do this. It'd be really nice if they could also help the youth on Sunday nights. So they need to be like really relevant to what's going on. And so we want them to do this, but then also this. And next thing you know, we've created this impossible job description. And we called that person, so we're looking for Gallagher McBroom. And Gallagher McBroom was our name for, great. Okay, now we need another. All we need is 50 Gallagher McBrooms and we'll be great. People that can do everything perfectly all the time. And so it was our playful way of going, okay, you understand you just made an impossible job description, right? Yeah. And so
church leadership, when they're looking for a senior pastor or what they want from a senior pastor, is way more than what's on that list. And so they just keep adding to the list of, we want somebody that can do all these things and more.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's not just Elevation that does that. I hear that all the time. And I'll be like, hey, so how many people in your city? Oh, about 1 million. Well, good luck going and finding the 7 people who actually fit that description that you can interview one of them, right?
That's exactly
Go find the 7.
Yeah.
And that's probably on the high side, right, for that. It happens all the time. And it really sets everything up for not working well. Here's the other piece, Frank, especially when it comes to the senior leader. This is the congregational piece, and I hear this a lot. It's the unstated expectations that somehow or another leak into the ear and the heart of the pastor.
Yeah.
And then he or she is trying to meet them.
That's right.
And that's why this 5 would keep you focused. I mean, all of us, some of us have more of it. All of us at some level have a little bit of people pleaser in us. We hate it. And it's not just that. For me, it's not a people pleaser. I don't like to disappoint people if I can avoid it. But I know it's inevitable as a leader, and so I don't lose sleep over it, but I try to avoid it. So when you have these unstated expectations and the pastor's like, oh, I don't want to disappoint them, now you're just making things worse. And now you're putting pressure on yourself, and now you're stretching the job description. And the truth of the matter is, you know how many of those unstated expectations you're actually going to end up fulfilling if you tried really hard? Probably none of them.
None of them.
Right?
Yeah.
And then there's the big piece to this is, and this was actually something that somebody said to us many years ago in our marriage. We had a recurring theme of, I thought you were going to, which would then escalate into a debate.
Yep.
You know what a debate is.
A debate. A healthy debate. Sometimes an unhealthy debate.
Sometimes an unhealthy debate. Sometimes a spiral, right? And so what someone said to us, and Nancy and I live by it to this day, is, Jim, expectations are not valid until 2 conditions have been met. They've been stated and agreed to.
Yeah.
Pastor,
it's great.
Was that stated? No. Was it agreed to? No. Okay.
There you go. There's your problem.
I think we're done here. Let's go back to some other things. Now, that's easier said than done, because in the day-to-day context of trying to care for people and live congregational life and do all the other things that you're doing, I know that's harder than what you and I just made it seem here. But I would try to draw us back. Pastor, don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. There are things that you're really, really good at, and things that really, really leverage the strength of who you are into the health of that congregation. Stick with those things.
I love it. I love these 5 roles, the clarity this brings. In fact, I would say clarifying expectations allows you to say, I'm sorry, a whole lot less.
Oh, man.
Because
that
now
needs to
we're
be
on
a
the
social
same
media
page.
feed somewhere. Why? That's so good.
Yeah,
Say that again.
clarifying expectations allows us to say, I'm sorry, a lot less. And so I think there's got to be this kind of recalibration of going back to make sure that we're clarifying. We're clarifying. And so, hey, if these aren't your 5, that's fine. Yeah. That's fine. Yeah. These are Jim's 5 that have come through a lot of wisdom and lots of closed door meetings and insights. So there's great value in these 5. But gosh, if you have other 5 or you have 3 that are same and 2 are different, we would love to hear that. So if you could put that in the comments or message us in any way, we would love to learn from you. But here's what I think the major takeaway is. Figure out your 5. In your context and what God has called you to, in your denomination, whatever it may be, how would you clarify your 5 and go, if I were to anchor everything I do to these 5, what are they and what does it look like to communicate that to the right people? I think it can be life-giving and freeing and be a game changer for you as you start the new year and really get going in 2025.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, Frank. And I'd love to hear in the comments, for somebody to say, what about, and then tell me what yours is that you'd have on the list. Just say, what about? And by the way, we'll answer those. If you put those in the comments, we'll come back. We'll say, hey, great question. Here's what our thought would be on that. But clarify your 5. Make sure that you're really leaning into that. And remember, in the Old Testament, there's prophet, king, and priest. Mm-hmm. You didn't have anyone who served as 2.
Yep.
Remember what Drucker said. Mm-hmm. I've known thousands of people who were good at one thing. Mm-hmm. I've known a few people who were good at 2. and no one who was really good at that third role.
So good.
And so that's the temptation. Even as you reassemble your 5, don't put king and priest in there because that's not on your list.
Right.
That's not. Now, I know a couple of guys who are senior leaders, I'm thinking of them right now, that are wired a lot like an executive pastor, but the reason they were successful is they stayed in the prophet lane and stayed out of the king lane, right? It's not that you can't do it. It's just that you don't need to do it. And just be clear about it.
That's so good.
It'll
Jim,
be more
thank
healthy
you.
for you.
Yeah.
You'll have a possible job description as opposed to an impossible job description. I think your effectiveness inside the organization will go up. I think your effectiveness at home will go up as well.
That's so good. That's so good. Remember, what happens here on next Sunday could change everything. So we hope you lean in on that. Really let it shape your ministry, and I hope you found this helpful. Continue to like, subscribe, share it, do all those things that you need to do, and we will see you again real soon.